Okay, well, welcome back to the next part of the chapter on perception, sensation and perception. We left off here talking, or technically, we left off on the previous slide talking about the poverty of stimulus argument. But what I had mentioned in covering that is the basic idea that perception is about construction, right? That we are perceiving this rich external world, and yet the data, if you will, that feeds into perception, the sensations, are considered impoverished and therefore don't contain all of that richness of the outside world. But yet, nevertheless, perception is in fact a very richly detailed kind of experience. And the the kind of supposition here now is that there needs to be a lot of internal things that happen that are going to kind of fill in the gaps and enrich the impoverished input. And so I think it is helpful, I find it helpful to create a schematic diagram of how this whole process is supposed to work. And I hopefully think this is going to help you visualize the perceptual process. So as I had mentioned last time, there are things out there in the world for us to perceive. In this case, we're calling that the distal stimulus, right? A thing at a distance that we become aware of. Here it's a tree, as you can see. But of course, one thing we want to keep in mind is that though this is a photograph of a tree, we don't have privileged access to that knowledge, right? We have to, in order for us to know that we're looking at a tree, we have to perceive it. So that means we have to follow the arrows from left to right here so that we can actually perceive something, right? So we don't have privileged access to know what's actually in this photograph. We have to see it and recognize it, right? So that means light reflects from the tree. It makes it into someone's eyes. We called that previously the proximal stimulus, right? So light rays are activating receptors, rods and cones inside of the eye and the retina. This causes action potentials, right? Neural activity. As we've described, this is going to result in awareness of visual sensations, right? So we're going to know that there's different colors. I highlighted here that there's some brown and green because we might say that the leaves of the tree are green, the tree trunk is brown, maybe. I've left off the sky being blue and all that sort of stuff, but obviously that's there as well. I did not list here anything like uh, areas being bright versus dark, but that would also be part of it as well. So variations in brightness throughout the visual scene, variations in color throughout the visual scene. That's how we would describe visual sensations. Now, I mentioned we become aware of visual sensations, but again, technically speaking, we're not immediately necessarily aware of visual sensations. And by that I mean that when you were pointing your eyes at this thing, and if someone were to come by and ask you what are you looking at right now, you're going to say there's a tree over there, right? You're not going to start by describing uh, the presence of green or brown or bright or dim sensations, right? We don't do that. Obviously, we can reflect on our experiences and talk about colors and brightness and so forth, but that's usually an extra step, right? That usually we're just immediately aware of, hey, that's a tree. But the perceptual theory says that in order to get to that point, to be aware of, hey, that's a tree, there's really an implicit, hidden kind of unconscious stage where the sensations are registered by the visual system, and then something happens to turn those sensations into perception. So this is the idea of sensation mediated perception, right? Perception, that high level awareness of that we all have of knowing what it is that we are looking at is mediated first by the visual sensations that we are given here. Of course, if we change the topic into an auditory situation where I'm hearing maybe music, then a perception is more about recognizing the musical instruments in the song, and the sensations would be the pitch and loudness of the various tones that we hear. But we'll stick with vision for this purpose here. So again, the idea is that sensations really don't contain psychological meaning. That's kind of at the heart of this concern here, this is part of that impoverished stimulus claim, is that just the mere presence of anything brown or green or any other color or brightness doesn't specify that it's a tree versus any other kind of an object. It's just a description of one little narrow aspect of the situation. It is not a information necessarily about the whole, about the object itself. But clearly perception is, right? Perception is all about recognizing objects. So what I have here is that in order to figure out what out there in the world is the distal stimulus, right? So let's think of this as the challenge, right? Our goal is to know what is the distal stimulus, but what our brains are given are just the sensations. So we have to infer what in the world is going on out there that caused this particular pattern of sensations. And so the claim is that there is an inferential process happening here. That what happens is that we infer the meaning of sensations. And by that, what we're saying is that we infer the distal cause of the sensations. We don't have contact with that tree out there in the world directly, immediately. We only have direct information about our sensations, and we have to infer their meaning, which means that essentially we have to translate them. There's another analogy that I like to use a lot. It's called the translator problem. If you're speaking to another person who speaks a language that you do not speak and they don't speak yours, then when they say something, obviously you don't know what it means. And you could try to infer, but the idea is that what you usually would do is you would have a translator, right? You would have somebody who speaks your language and theirs. And so when that other person says something in their language, the translator hears that, converts it to your language, and then you're able to understand, right? Except there is this concern that what you know is only what the translator has told you, and not directly what the other person has said. And we can maybe use that a little bit here as an analogy to what's happening with perception. Here, the person speaking the other language is the distal stimulus, and now the sensations are serving as the translator, converting this physical information and data about the world into your psychological awareness, right? Note then the importance of how I drew the perceptual tree. I didn't just copy and paste the photograph of the tree on the left, but rather I use this more cartoonish tree to emphasize that what's happened is that we have constructed a mental representation of the tree that is happening out there in the world, right? And so that's the argument here, is that perception is in fact a construction. It is a mental representation of reality. It isn't necessarily the same as reality itself. Now, to make a little point here at the bottom, I have that little note about statistics, right? So I think this is a very useful analogy, at least if you've had the stats course. So the idea is that when you're doing statistics, you have a sample, right? You get some data, and when you analyze that data, you calculate a mean and a standard deviation and all that sort of stuff. And we call all of that descriptive statistics because it tells us something about some patterns that are present in the data. But of course, if I want to answer some kind of more complex question with my data, like if I have two samples and I want to know what's going on with these samples and do they reflect some important pattern that exists in reality, that's when I have to do something like a t-test or an ANOVA to do what's called inferential statistics, which is to infer some bigger, broader meaning from the sample, right? And so then the descriptive statistics are fed through a decision rule, right? And the decision rule is essentially one that computes a test statistic and then compares the results of that to a known distribution. And that's where you look in the back of your stats book to see the T table or the F table. And then you determine whether or not your test statistic exceeds some critical value so that you can reject the null hypothesis and make some claims. Well, that is kind of how we might think about this process as well, is that the sensations contain descriptions, and then we might generate a hypothesis internally about what is the meaning of the sensations, that is, what is the distal stimulus, and then maybe there is some kind of process we could use um, to evaluate that claim, right, and to see if our interpretation should be rejected or accepted, right? We're gonna have a little more detail later in the notes on that exact idea, but that's at least one way to think about it. So, a couple of things to say about that here. There's some particular uh, implications, if you will, about this constructivist view of perception, right? So this is summarizing the perspective, right? The sensation-mediated view says that perception is built up out of sensations. So when we use that, of course, that means to build up means to construct. So we're calling it perception a construction here. One thing I want you to kind of think about is that if you've heard of processes like bottom up and top down processing before, you should definitely think about that here, right? Because bottom up processing, one way to think of bottom up processing is to literally think of construction, right? Like let's imagine you have a bunch of bricks and you start by putting pieces of these bricks on the ground, and then you put bricks on top of those, and then you put bricks on top of those, and eventually you have built a wall, right? So you have bottom up built your wall, and you make four walls, and you've made a house, right? So that's bottom up processing. It's construction, right? We are building something up. So we've constructed a whole, like a whole house, out of individual units, the bricks, and those would be the sensations here. So in this case, again, we use sensations to build up this constructive process, and we create this mental representation in this case here. And, corresponding to that cartoonish drawing of the tree I had in the previous diagram, this becomes an image, this mental image that we can visualize in our mind's eye. So we can invoke this concept of this is where things get weird, right? What is this theater of the mind? When you close your eyes and visualize a tree or any other object, you've created this internal theater of the mind, and it's almost like you have this mental object and a mental eye that's seeing the object. What this kind of mental imagery is all about is not quite clear, but that's presumably the idea here of perception itself is all about this kind of mental theatrics. Um, and that's to set aside the whole idea of aphantasia, because we know that there's plenty of research, I guess plenty, but there's a growing amount of research in recent years about individual differences in this kind of imagery. And not everyone has such clear, complete imagery that they can definitely close their eyes and visually see a tree or any other object in their mind's eye. Um, but nevertheless, people, whether they have rich visual imagery or not, um, they can still perceive the world accurately and clearly. What does that mean for perceptual theory? Does it mean that imagery of the kind we're talking about is not really relevant to perception? Does it mean that this constructivist view of perception might even be wrong? Well, it's hard to say, but I do want to at least point out for now that this sensation-mediated, impoverished stimulus constructivist view of perception is not universally accepted. It is maybe the most long-standing mainstream view of perception. So we're going to give it obviously a lot of attention, but there are alternative perspectives here. Of course, one of the reasons why we might otherwise be concerned about this theory is some of the other implications it has for humans in reality in general, right? So the argument here is that if perception is a constructed reality, this raises the question of how do we know it even matches any actual reality, right? Going back to my translator issue, how do I know that the translator has told me the truth, right? Maybe they were lying, or maybe there's something lost in translation. And so there's always these concerns, right? So I have thrown in some philosophical terms here, a bunch of isms. Realism is the perspective that what we know and what we perceive does correspond to reality. Nominalism is that when we perceive, we are putting things into categories that are essentially socially defined categories or social constructs. So the argument, for example, is that when we look at, let's talk about different kinds of animals like dogs, right? One exercise is to try to understand what makes a dog in the first place. And we could come up with all kinds of important criteria, like he has a fur coat, four legs and a tail, and barks and these various things. But what's kind of tricky here is that when we do that, we oftentimes discover that these characteristics are true of dogs, but they're also true of other animals. So they're not necessarily um, kind of necessary characteristics here that are unique and distinguish dogs from non-dogs. On top of that, dogs can be very, very different from other dogs. There's a ton of variety of different breeds of dogs. So the nature of their appearance can change quite dramatically. And then we also look at DNA, right? But the thing is that we don't do DNA testing on animals in order to just look at and say, hey, that's a dog, right? I don't have to do a DNA test. I recognize a dog when I see one. Importantly, small children, 2 and 3 year old children, get pretty good at recognizing dogs and cats without understanding any of that stuff, right? But of course, genetically, what's relevant here is that the genetic differences between dogs and cats are not any more quantitatively different than the genetic differences between a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, right? In terms of the genetic differences that make a Great Dane and a Chihuahua different from each other. So what I'm trying to get across here is that from a biological perspective, there is no particular dog gene necessarily, that if you have this gene, this means you're a dog. Um, and genetic differences across species in the animal kingdom tend to be slightly more quantitative and subtle than qualitative and sharply delineating one species from another. And the long and short of what I'm trying to get at here is that the entire concept of an animal species doesn't have a clear-cut definition within genetics and biology. Um, but it does have a clear-cut definition when it comes to human communication. We have a natural tendency to label things. And so the argument here is that what might be happening is called categorical perception, that the world outside of us doesn't necessarily consist of categories, but we have created these categories, and therefore we are imposing these categories on the world through this kind of perceptual construction. So that would suggest the potential that the categorical way in which we label reality is not necessarily something that is true of reality, right? Another example of this is colors, right? Because colors with the visible spectrum of light goes from 400 to 700 nanometers of light. And that is a continuous quantitative transition in wavelength across that range. But when we perceive light in those wavelengths, we categorize it in terms of the colors of the rainbow, right? The Roy G. Biv. And again, that categorization into a finite group of colors, right? We have 300 different values of wavelengths here. And yet we perceive 6 or 7 colors. It's so again, the idea is that we have performed some sort of a dimension reduction here, and maybe that's what perception is in some respect, right? It's reducing variability and it's doing dimensional reduction to to categorize. But what those category boundaries though are potentially arbitrary, right? It might be that if I go from 420 nanometers of light to 421 nanometers of light, that the difference as far as a human observer is concerned is both of those are blue. But on the other hand, if I move up towards 480 nanometers to 481 nanometers, that 1 nanometer difference might be critical to the point of saying the first one is blue, but the second one is green. And that's where we start to think, where does that boundary come from? What is that all about? That's hard to explain, really. So once we start questioning the mapping between our perceptual world and our perceptual categories and the outside reality, that's when we move into these other philosophical concerns where things may be problematic, like skepticism. So it could be possible that we might start to become skeptical of human knowledge and to doubt whether anything that we know truly corresponds to reality, or it might all be an illusion. If you've ever seen The Matrix or any other various movies of that ilk, that's kind of what they're all suggesting, right? Is that our immediate perceptual reality is in some way false, and there's something else going on behind the scenes. You might have heard of the whole concept of the holographic universe or the simulation theory that suggests that there's something behind the scenes to the reality that we live in. This is all forms of skepticism. We can take that one step further. I don't want to belabor the point, but the next ism is solipsism, and that is once we start to this down this maybe slippery slope of questioning and doubting reality, we might begin to ask harder questions such as, well, how do I know that anything is real at all? Right? And it's not just whether there's a different reality behind the scenes of my perceptual experience, but maybe there's nothing at all behind the scenes, behind the curtains of my perceptual reality, which means that maybe the only thing that exists is not this world outside of me that I think that I live in, but it's just me, my own mind. This is where we get the famous Cartesian cogito, right? The cogito ergo sum means I think or I doubt, therefore I am. So maybe my mind exists, but any other external thing might not exist, right? We don't we don't want to do either of these things, right? These are not attractive philosophical positions. So we want to be realists, but of course, ultimately, the concern is how do we ensure realism, right? How do we ensure that we can trust our senses? Okay, now reverting back to some of the problems that I had outlined here in perception, one of the things that we were getting into were the what kinds of patterns exist here. So when talking about visual patterns, again, we've talked about what the nature of the sensations are. We've got brightness and color, but a pattern would consist of changes in brightness and color across the scene. And can we figure out does this variegated pattern of brightness and color contain a pattern? Well, there are some patterns. What we might find, for example, is that at certain spatial locations in the image, between certain pixels at a certain horizontal or vertical location in the scene, there's a consistent boundary between a dark and a light area, right? This is especially useful if we ignore color for a moment and just focus on brightness values and shades of gray. There might be dark areas and light areas side by side, and that boundary persists in the same range of spatial positions. And that's going to then, at one level, at a visual level, we call that contrast because contrast is the ratio in brightness levels between a dark and a light area. But in a more everyday kind of language, that's an edge, right? It's a boundary between, a light and a dark area. I'm just kind of looking for something that might have some contrast here. Well, here's one, for example. So my little notebook here with the post-its on it here. This is really color contrast. The brightness is there too, but the idea is that consistent changes in color or brightness at a specific location in the visual scene corresponds to an edge, right? The boundary between one object and another object, or the boundary between an object and its background. Um, there might also be other patterns that are useful here. So the specific edges and contrast elements might actually map out certain kinds of depth cues that could be used for size and distance perception as well. So that's going to be potentially a useful kind of pattern. But now, of course, the idea is that we have to interpret the pattern, right? And so again, as I had invoked earlier, bottom-up processing is something that you should think about. We can try to imagine a way in which we're going to use bottom-up processing to build up a interpretation of the perceptual world. But there might also be a need for top-down processing as well. So the first thing we're going to cover is bottom-up processing. But maybe in the interest of breaking these lectures up, this one is going on for a long time. This whole chapter is going on for a long time. I'm going to save the bottom up part for its own standalone little bit segment. And then from there, I'll shift over into the top down segment, which I think will probably be able to wrap it up. So two more videos on this chapter, bottom up and then top down processing is probably where we'll go there. So, okay. Uh, in that event, I think we are done with this video. Okay, until the next one.